What would you do if the world you knew turned to thunder and dust in an instant? For Cora Dean, a widow living on the lonely edge of the Texas frontier, that question became terrifyingly real. It wasn't bandits or sickness that came for her, but the earth itself shaking under the weight of 1,000 stampeding buffalo. In the heart of that chaos was a single terrified Comanche boy. Her choice in that one desperate moment to save him from being trampled into the plains would change her life forever. She thought the danger was over. But when she woke the next morning, the real trial had just begun. 150 of the deadliest warriors in the territory, the Omega Comanche, stood silent as stone at her door. The heat of the Texas Panhandle in late August was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the air and baked the life from the cracked earth. Cora Dean felt it in the sweat that trickled down her temples and the dry rasp in her throat. From the porch of her small, sturdy cabin, she watched the horizon, a shimmering line where the vast, pale sky met the endless sea of parched grass. It had been 2 years since her husband Henry had been taken by a rattler's bite, leaving her with nothing but this 160-acre homestead, a stubborn mule named Samson, and a resolve as hard and unyielding as the land itself. Black Creek Crossing wasn't much just her cabin, a barn and a well that miraculously never ran dry, all nestled in a shallow dip that offered meager protection from the ceaseless wind. The nearest town, Redemption, was a full day's ride east, and she preferred it that way. The townsfolk, with their pitying glances and whispered judgments about a woman living alone, were a harsher climate than any summer drought. She was checking the leather straps on her saddle, preparing for a ride along the creek bed to check her snares when she first felt it. Not a sound, but a vibration, a low, deep thrumming that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. It was a feeling, she knew, a primal hum that spoke of immense weight and motion. Samson, tethered to the porch rail, grew skittish, his ears twitching as he pulled against his rope. Cora straightened up her hand, instinctively going to shade her eyes. She scanned the northern horizon. At first there was nothing. Then a dark smudge appeared, a low-lying cloud that wasn't a cloud at all. It was a roiling curtain of dust, growing larger, wider, consuming the sky. The thrumming intensified, becoming a tangible force that vibrated in her chest. "Buffalo," she breathed, her voice tight. But this was no casual herd. This was a stampede. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she ruthlessly beat it down. Henry had taught her that panic was a luxury the frontier didn't afford. Her mind raced, calculating. The cabin was solid, built of thick sod and timber. It would hold. The barn was less certain, but Samson was her priority. With swift, practiced movements, she untied the mule, slapped his rump, and sent him trotting toward the relative safety of the barn. She secured the heavy crossbar on the barn door, just as the low thrumming escalated into a deafening roar. She ran back to the cabin, her boots kicking up puffs of ochre dust. The ground was now visibly shaking. Inside, she slammed the door and barred it, the noise of the approaching herd like a physical blow against the walls. She grabbed her Winchester rifle from its pegs above the mantelpiece, not for defense against the beasts that would be like trying to stop the tide with a teacup, but for the comfort of its familiar weight. She peered through a small crack in the window shutter. The vanguard of the herd appeared over the rise, a terrifying wave of dark fur horns and steam. They weren't just running. They were a singular entity of blind, primal fear, a force of nature unleashed. The sound was overwhelming, a constant rolling thunder of hooves that drowned out all other thought. The cabin groaned as the earth shook violently. A tin cup rattled off a shelf and clattered to the floor unheard in the cacophony. For what felt like an eternity, she watched the river of flesh and fury pour across her land. They thundered past her cabin, their massive bodies a blur of motion just yards from her door. It was a spectacle of terrifying power, a reminder of how small and fragile she was in this untamed world. Then, through the swirling dust and the chaos, she saw something that didn't belong. A flash of color, a small figure no taller than her shoulder, running desperately. It was a boy. He was native, his dark hair streaming behind him, his small legs pumping in a futile race against the tide. He had likely been caught out on the plain, perhaps hunting prairie dogs when the terror began. He was on the edge of the herd, but the edge was crumbling with more beasts pressing in from the center. He stumbled, fell, and scrambled back to his feet, his face a mask of pure terror. A huge bull, its eyes white with mindless panic, veered directly toward him. Cora didn't think. She acted. She threw the cabin door open, the roar of the stampede washing over her. The Winchester was in her hands. She knew she couldn't stop the bull, not with a single shot, not in time. But she could change its path. Aiming high, well above the beast's head, she fired. The crack of the rifle was sharp and piercing a sound, distinct from the dull thunder of the hooves. The bull, already frantic, shied at the unexpected gunshot. It swerved violently, its immense momentum carrying it away from the boy. It was enough. It was the only chance she could give him. "Here!" she screamed, her voice raw and nearly swallowed by the noise. "To the cabin run." The boy's head snapped around. He saw her a lone figure, framed in the doorway, her rifle still smoking. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, his ingrained fear of a white settler warring with the immediate, overwhelming threat of being trampled to dust. Cora waved her arm frantically, a clear, desperate gesture. That broke his paralysis. He scrambled, half running, half falling, toward the sanctuary of her doorway. The ground behind him was a churning mass of hooves and horns. Cora reached out her hand, closing around his thin, sinewy arm, and yanked him inside with all her strength. She slammed the heavy oak door shut, just as a half-ton of buffalo scraped against the outer wall, making the entire cabin shudder. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving, the smell of dust, sweat, and gunpowder filling her lungs. The thunder outside continued unabated. On the floor, the boy lay gasping, his small body trembling uncontrollably. He was young, no more than 9 or 10, clad in a simple hide breechcloth and moccasins. A deep gash ran along his temple, where a rock or a stray hoof must have struck him, and his right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly broken. His dark eyes, wide with pain and shock, fixed on hers. They held no gratitude, only a fierce, cornered terror. Cora held up her hands, palms open, the universal sign of peace. "You're safe," she said softly, though she knew he likely didn't understand her words. "You're safe now." The thunder of the plains raged on outside, but inside the small sod cabin, a new and far more complicated storm was just beginning to brew. The stampede raged for another 20 minutes, a relentless torrent of sound and fury that seemed to shake the cabin to its very foundations. When it finally began to subside, the thunderous roar fading to a distant rumble, an eerie silence descended, broken only by the boy's ragged, pain-filled breaths. Cora pushed herself away from the door, her own adrenaline beginning to wane, leaving an exhausted tremor in her limbs. The boy had dragged himself into a corner, trying to make himself small, his eyes tracking her every move like a wary coyote pup. His leg was a mess. The bone had broken through the skin, a clean but gruesome fracture that would need immediate and skilled attention. "Easy now," she murmured, keeping her voice low and even. "I'm not going to hurt you. I need to look at your leg." She moved slowly, deliberately, fetching a bucket of precious water from the barrel by the hearth. She tore strips from a clean linen sheet, her movements efficient. Henry, for all his toughness, had been prone to accidents, and she'd learned to set bones, stitch wounds, and fight fevers with a grim proficiency. As she approached the boy, he flinched, pressing himself harder into the corner. A low growl, more animal than human, emanated from his throat. Cora stopped a few feet away, setting the water and linens on the floor. "I know you're scared," she said, her voice gentle. "But if we don't fix this, you'll lose the leg. Or worse." She pointed to his injury, then mimed the act of washing and wrapping it. The boy stared at her, his intelligent eyes weighing her actions against a lifetime of warnings about her people. He glanced down at his mangled leg at the dark blood staining the floorboards, and a flicker of understanding, or perhaps just desperation, crossed his face. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. The work was agonizing. Cora had to clean the wound, fighting back her own nausea at the sight of splintered bone. She gave the boy a strip of leather to bite down on, and his knuckles were white as he clenched it between his teeth. Setting the bone was the worst part. It required a swift, brutal pull and twist that elicited a strangled scream from the boy, a sound that tore at Cora's heart. He didn't cry out again, though his body was slick with sweat, and his breathing came in harsh, shuddering gasps. She worked meticulously, fashioning a splint from 2 flat pieces of kindling and wrapping the leg tightly with the linen strips. She cleaned the gash on his temple and saw that it was shallow, already beginning to clot. When she was done, she gently maneuvered him onto a cot in the corner of the room, covering him with a threadbare woolen blanket. Exhausted and pale, the boy finally succumbed to the pain and shock his eyes, fluttering closed. Cora spent the next few hours putting her world back in order. The buffalo had destroyed her small vegetable garden, trampling it into mulch. A section of her fence was flattened as if it had never existed. But the cabin, the barn, and the well were intact. Samson was shaken but unharmed. It could have been much worse. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of orange and violet, she sat at a small wooden table, cleaning her rifle, the scent of gun oil filling the quiet cabin. The boy slept his breathing, shallow but steady. She wondered who he was, where his people were. He was Comanche, she was almost certain, judging by his moccasins and the single hawk feather tied in his hair. They were a proud, fierce people who rarely ventured this close to the settlements anymore, not since the last treaty pushed them further west. Had they been hunting, was a war party nearby? The questions hung in the air unanswered and unsettling. A sharp, authoritative knock on the door made her jump. Her hand tightened on the Winchester. Visitors were rare, and unexpected ones were almost always trouble. "Cora Dean." A man's voice called out, laced with an arrogant assurance she knew all too well. "I know you're in there. I saw the herd came through, just making sure you're still in one piece. Bartholomew Thorne." Cora's jaw tightened. Thorne was a cattle baron who had bought up thousands of acres north of her property. He was a man whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. He'd made no secret of the fact that he wanted her land. Black Creek was the only reliable water source for 10 miles in any direction, and her homestead sat squarely upon its most accessible point. She moved to the door, the rifle held loosely at her side. "I'm fine, Mr. Thorne," she called through the wood. "Well, open up. It's not neighborly to talk through a door." With a sigh of resignation, she lifted the bar and opened the door, a crack blocking the entrance with her body. Thorne stood on her porch, flanked by 2 of his hired hands, both of whom had the dull, menacing look of men who were paid to crack heads, not ask questions. Thorne himself was a large man, dressed in clothes that were too fine for the frontier, his face florid and his smile thin. Just as I thought. Tough as old leather, he said, his eyes scanning her face before flicking past her into the dim interior of the cabin. A woman's got no business living out here alone. It's a dangerous place. I've told you my offer to buy you out still stands. It's more than generous. And I've told you my answer is still no, Cora said, her voice cold. This was my husband's land. It's my land now. Thorne's gaze sharpened his eyes, locking onto something behind her. His smile widened, but it held no warmth. It was the smile of a predator that had just scented blood. Well now, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. What have we here? He pushed the door open before she could react, striding into her home as if he owned it. His men followed their presence, filling the small space with an unspoken threat. Thorne walked directly to the cot and looked down at the sleeping Comanche boy. An Injun, he sneered, prodding the boy's splintered leg with the toe of his expensive boot. The boy whimpered in his sleep but didn't wake. You're harboring a savage, Mrs. Dean. Do you have any idea how foolish that is? The Comanche are killers, vipers. You bring one into your home, the rest of the nest is sure to follow. He's a child, Cora snapped, moving to stand between Thorne and the cot. He was caught in the stampede. I couldn't just leave him to die. You should have, Thorne said flatly. His eyes glinted with a sudden, malevolent inspiration. The folks in Redemption have been jumpy lately, hearing rumors of Comanche raiding parties up north. A woman found dead in her cabin, harboring a red skin. It paints a tragic picture, a picture that might just convince the territorial marshal that this land needs a firmer hand to manage it. Someone who knows how to deal with the native problem. The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the air like thick smoke. He wasn't just trying to intimidate her anymore. He was giving her a glimpse of the story he would tell after her unfortunate accident. Get out of my house, Thorne, Cora said, her voice low and trembling with a rage she hadn't felt since Henry died. She raised the Winchester, the muzzle now level with his chest. Thorne's eyes widened slightly, not with fear, but with amusement. He looked from the rifle to her face. Spirit! He chuckled, shaking his head. A shame it's so misplaced. He backed away slowly, his hands raised in mock surrender. All right, Mrs. Dean, have it your way. You keep your little pet. But when his kin come calling, don't expect any help from your neighbors. They'll be too busy helping me string you both up. He turned and walked out, his men right behind him. Cora slammed the door and barred it, her heart pounding against her ribs. She listened as the sound of their horses faded into the night. The cabin was silent again, but the peace was gone. Thorne had seen the boy. He had seen an opportunity. The danger was no longer a vague, abstract threat from the wilderness. It now had a name, a face, and a plan. In the corner, the boy stirred, his dark eyes opening. He had been awake for the whole exchange. He looked at Cora, then at the door, and then back at Cora. The fear in his eyes was still there, but it was now mingled with something else. A shared understanding. They both had an enemy, and he was riding to town to gather a storm. Sleep offered no escape for Cora that night. She dozed fitfully in her chair by the cold hearth, the Winchester laid across her lap. Every rustle of the wind in the thatch, every hoot of a distant owl sent a jolt of alarm through her. She dreamt of Thorne's smug face, of thunderous hooves, and of dark, accusatory eyes. When she finally drifted into a deeper sleep just before dawn, it was a heavy, dreamless slumber that offered little rest. What woke her was the silence. It was an unnatural quiet, a profound absence of the normal morning sounds. There were no chirping crickets, no bird song heralding the sunrise, no rustle of prairie grass in the breeze. The world outside her cabin seemed to be holding its breath. It was the kind of absolute stillness that precedes either a tornado or a massacre. A faint grey light filtered through the shutters. Cora sat up, her back aching, her senses on high alert. The boy was awake too. He was sitting up on the cot, his small body rigid, his gaze fixed on the cabin door. He wasn't looking with fear, but with a kind of solemn expectation. Cora rose and moved silently to the window. She nudged the shutter open a fraction of an inch and peered out. Her heart stopped. The world had been transformed. Her small, dusty yard was gone. In its place stood a sea of men and horses, so still they might have been carved from the very rock of the plains. They were warriors, Comanche. They were arranged in a wide, silent semicircle around her cabin, their lines perfect and disciplined, stretching from the edge of the creek to the rise behind the barn. There were dozens of them, 100. More. She tried to count, but her mind refused to process the number. Each man sat astride a pinto war pony, and each man was armed. Some held long, hide-wrapped lances adorned with eagle feathers. Others had bows, their quivers bristling with arrows. Many carried rifles, the morning light glinting dully off their steel barrels. They were painted for war. Their faces were stark canvases of black and vermilion, fierce symbols of clan and spirit. Their chests were bare, scarred with the marks of past battles and sun dances. They were a vision from the oldest, darkest tales of the frontier, a living embodiment of every settler's nightmare. And they were utterly, unnervingly silent. No war cries, no whoops, no threats. Just a profound, watchful stillness that was more terrifying than any sound. Cora felt the blood drain from her face. Thorne's mocking words echoed in her mind. "You bring one into your home, the rest of the nest is sure to follow." He had been right. She had saved one boy, and in doing so had summoned an army to her doorstep. Her gaze fell upon the warrior at the very center of the formation, directly in front of her door. He was clearly the leader. He was taller than the others, his presence commanding, even from a distance. He wore a magnificent war bonnet of eagle feathers that cascaded down his back, and his face was painted with a stark black symbol that resembled a hawk in flight. Unlike the others, he was not looking at the cabin. He was looking east toward the rising sun, as if waiting for a signal. Cora backed away from the window, her breath catching in her throat. This was it. This was how she died. She thought of Henry, of the life they had tried to build here, of the stubborn pride that had kept her from selling the land. It seemed like a foolish vanity now. She looked over at the boy. He had pushed his blanket aside and was attempting to stand his face, grim with determination. He looked at Cora, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was young, but the word was clear and carried the weight of his language. "Tohopka," he said, and nodded toward the warrior chief outside. Then he tapped his own chest. "Taka." He had given her their names, Tohopka, Shadow Hawk, and he was Taka. Before Cora could process this, the boy began to drag himself toward the door, his splintered leg scraping awkwardly against the floorboards. "What are you doing?" Cora whispered, rushing to his side. "You can't go out there." Taka looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He pointed at his own chest, then at her, and then gestured toward the silent army outside. He was trying to tell her something, to explain the inexplicable, but there was no time. The light outside shifted. The first rays of the rising sun crested the horizon, bathing the plains in a soft, golden glow. At that exact moment, as if touched by the light itself, the warrior chief Shadow Hawk turned his head and fixed his gaze upon her cabin door. His eyes, even from 50 yards away, seemed to pierce right through the wood, right through her. He raised his hand. It was not a threat. It was a signal. With a single fluid motion, every warrior dismounted. The sound of over 100 pairs of moccasins hitting the dry earth was a soft, unified sigh. They did not draw their weapons. They did not advance. They simply stood beside their horses, their eyes locked on her home, waiting. The sheer, disciplined precision of the movement was breathtaking and utterly terrifying. They were the Omega Comanche, she realized with a sickening certainty. The elite of the elite, the warriors whose name was only spoken in hushed, fearful whispers by soldiers and settlers alike. And all 150 of them were standing in her yard. The bar on the door felt flimsy and useless. The thick oak seemed like paper. Her Winchester felt like a child's toy. There was no escape. There was no defense. There was only the silent waiting army and the dawn. Taka reached the door and fumbled with the bar. Cora stood frozen, torn, between stopping him and the paralyzing certainty that nothing she did mattered anymore. Her fate had been sealed the moment she fired her rifle at that stampeding bull. With a heavy clunk, Taka managed to lift the bar. The door swung inward with a low groan, flooding the dim cabin with the bright, clean light of the new day. Framed in the doorway, the full awe-inspiring spectacle of the Comanche war party was revealed. They were a wall of silent, painted flesh and steel, and at their head, Shadowhawk took a single deliberate step forward. The long night of fear was over, and the morning of judgment had arrived. The morning air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating fear that had settled in Cora's chest. She stood just behind Taka, her knuckles white, where she gripped the stock of her rifle. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the profound silence of the assembled warriors. Shadowhawk walked forward alone, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped about 20 feet from the porch. He was an imposing figure, his face a mask of stern authority, his eyes dark and piercing. He looked past Cora, his gaze settling on Taka, who was leaning heavily against the doorframe. A flicker of emotion relief, so profound it was almost painful to witness, crossed the chief's features before being suppressed back into stoic impassivity. Taka spoke his young voice, carrying clearly in the stillness. He spoke in the flowing, guttural language of the Comanche, his words tumbling out in a rush. He pointed to his splintered leg, then to Cora, then pantomimed the stampeding buffalo and the crack of a rifle. He was telling the story. Cora watched Shadowhawk's face, trying to decipher his reaction. His expression remained unreadable, carved from stone. When Taka finished, a heavy silence fell once more. The chief's eyes moved from his son to Cora. He studied her, his gaze intense, sweeping over her worn dress, her calloused hands, the rifle she still held, and the exhaustion etched onto her face. He saw not a threat, but a woman who had weathered a storm. Then he spoke. His voice was deep, a resonant baritone that commanded attention. To Cora's astonishment, his words were in English, halting, heavily accented but clear. "You are the woman who stood against the thunder?" he asked. Cora swallowed, finding her voice. "He was just a boy. I couldn't let him die." Shadowhawk nodded slowly. "My son. My only son. Taka. He carries the blood of my grandfather, a great chief." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The people would be broken if he was lost. He took another step forward and laid his rifle on the ground, a clear gesture of non-aggression. He then turned to his warriors and issued a short, sharp command. In unison, the Omega Comanche leaned their own rifles against their saddles and unstrung their bows. The message was clear: they had not come for war. Cora slowly, cautiously lowered the muzzle of her own Winchester. "My son tells me you fought the metal beast for him." Shadowhawk continued, gesturing toward the railroad tracks, far to the south. Taka had obviously mistaken the sound of her rifle for a train. "No. You fired your weapon to turn the great bull. Taka owes you his life. A debt of life for the son of a chief is a debt for all his people." He raised his hand again. 2 warriors came forward, leading a horse. It was a magnificent creature, a deep chestnut mare with a white blaze on its face, far finer than any horse Cora had ever seen. They also carried bundles wrapped in buffalo hide. "This is a gift," Shadowhawk said. "A fine horse. Blankets from the winter count. Smoked meat to fill your home. It is not enough. A life cannot be paid for with goods." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "We will stay. We will guard this place. My son's leg is broken. He cannot be moved until the bone sickness is past. Until he is healed, you are under the protection of my warriors. This is the law of the people." Cora stared, dumbfounded. 150 of the most feared warriors on the plains were not here to kill her. They were here to be her personal bodyguards. The absurdity of it, the sheer unbelievable twist of fate, was almost too much to comprehend. Meanwhile, a different scene was unfolding in the town of Redemption. Bartholomew Thorne had ridden hard through the night, arriving at the saloon just after midnight. He burst through the doors, his face a mask of righteous fury. The Comanche, he roared to the assembled crowd of late-night drinkers and gamblers. "They're on the move. A war party, not 10 miles from here." Instantly the saloon fell silent. Men turned from their cards and their whiskey, their faces pale in the lantern light. Sheriff Emmett Reed, a weary man with a drooping mustache and tired eyes, pushed himself up from his corner table. "What's this?" Thorne Reed asked, his voice gravelly. "You see them yourself." "With my own 2 eyes." Thorne lied, his voice booming with false sincerity. "I rode out to check on the widow Dean, see if she weathered the stampede. And what do I find? Her cabin is swarming with them. They have a young buck inside with her. An advance scout, no doubt. She's either their prisoner or, God forgive me, a collaborator." A murmur of fear and anger rippled through the crowd. The word collaborator was poison. "She's in league with them savages, one of Thorne's hired hands," shouted from the back. "They're using her homestead as a staging ground to attack the town." The spark had been lit. Years of fear, suspicion, and hatred of the Comanche fanned the flames. Men who had lost family in old raids, men who coveted land, men who were simply drunk and looking for a fight, they all surged to their feet. "Now hold on, Sheriff Reed," said, holding up a hand. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Cora Dean is a good woman. Stubborn but good. I'll ride out there at first light with a deputy and see what's what." "By first light they could be burning our homes," Thorne bellowed, playing the crowd like a fiddle. "Reed, you're either with us or against us. Are you going to protect this town, or are you going to protect a traitor who's opened her door to painted killers? We need to form a posse. We ride now and deal with this threat before it's too late." The cry was taken up by the mob. "A posse! Let's ride!" Sheriff Reed saw the situation slipping from his control. He was 1 man against 30, and Thorne had them in a fever. He was a man of the law, but the law was a thin and fragile thing on the frontier, easily shredded by a mob's fear. "This is a mistake," Reed said, his voice grim. "You ride out there, half-cocked, and you'll start a war that will soak this whole territory in blood." But no one was listening. Thorne was already directing his men, handing out rifles and ammunition from his saddlebags. He was no longer just a landowner. He was a general, leading an army of frightened and angry men on a righteous crusade. As the sun rose over Black Creek Crossing, illuminating the silent, honor-bound Comanche warriors standing guard, a second far more dangerous army was gathering to the east. An army fueled by lies, ignorance, and the consuming greed of one man. The stage was set for a collision, and Cora Dean's small homestead was about to become the epicenter of a storm that would decide the fate of them all. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning chill and baking the plains in its relentless glare. An uneasy rhythm established itself at Black Creek Crossing. The Comanche warriors were a study in disciplined patience. They set up a perimeter tending to their horses and checking their weapons, their movements economical and purposeful. They spoke in low tones, their quiet confidence a stark contrast to the volatile tension Cora felt. Taka was moved from the cot to a pallet of soft furs the warriors had brought. An old medicine man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, examined the boy's leg, nodding in approval at Cora's handiwork, before applying a poultice of crushed herbs that smelled of sage and damp earth. Cora found herself in a surreal domestic bubble, surrounded by an army. She communicated with Shadow Hawk through a mixture of his broken English, her simple gestures, and Taka's occasional translations. She learned that they had been on a ceremonial hunt when Taka, trying to prove his bravery by stalking a lone antelope, had wandered too far and been caught by the stampede. They had searched for him through the night, their fear growing with every passing hour until they found his tracks mingled with the churning earth of the herd, leading directly to her cabin. "You have courage," Shadow Hawk said, watching her as she refilled her water bucket at the well, two stern warriors standing guard nearby. "Most of your people would have shot him. Or run?" "He was a child in trouble," Cora replied, simply wiping sweat from her brow. "That's all I saw." Shadow Hawk looked at her small, lonely cabin, at the neglected garden and the patched roof. "You have suffered loss," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "I see it in your eyes. The same shadow lives in mine." Cora paused, surprised by his perception. "My husband, Henry. He died 2 years ago." My wife, Shadow Hawk, responded, his gaze turning distant. "She was taken by the white man's coughing sickness last winter. Taka is all I have left of her." In that moment, the gulf between them of culture, of language, of history, seemed to shrink. He was not just a fearsome warrior chief, and she was not just a white settler. They were two parents, two leaders who understood the terrible fragility of life and the fierce protective love that came with it. An unspoken understanding, a fragile thread of mutual respect was woven between them. But as this quiet alliance solidified at the creek, the storm in Redemption was reaching a fever pitch. Sheriff Reed had managed to delay Thorne's posse for a few hours, arguing for caution for confirmation. But his authority was eroding with every passing minute. Thorne's agents moved through the town, spreading rumors like wildfire. The Comanche had taken the widow Dean hostage. They had tortured her. They were planning to use her well to poison the water supply. The stories grew more lurid and improbable, but in the grip of fear, people believed them. The only person to publicly stand with the sheriff was Caleb Grizz Vance. Grizz was an old mountain man, a former scout for the army, who had settled in Redemption to live out his days. His face was a leathery landscape of sun and wind, and he'd forgotten more about the native tribes than most men ever knew. He'd been a friend of Henry Dean's, and he felt a gruff, paternal protectiveness for Cora. He found Sheriff Reed in his office, cleaning a shotgun with grim resignation. "You can't let them do this," Emmett Grizz said, his voice a low rumble. "Thorne is lying through his teeth. The Comanche, especially the Omega bands, they don't operate like that. They don't send a boy as a scout, and they don't hole up in a sodbuster's cabin to plan an attack. It makes no sense. I know that, and you know that Reed sighed, not looking up from his work. But there are 40 men out there loading their rifles who don't. They're scared, and Thorne is pointing their fear like a loaded gun. Then you have to get out there first, Grizz insisted. Get to Cora's place. Find out the truth of it before that mob does. I aim to Reed, said finally meeting the old scout's eyes. But Thorne's got lookouts. They'll see me coming and use it as proof that I'm trying to warn her. They'll start the ride the second I saddle my horse. A grim understanding passed between the two men. Thorne doesn't want Justice Grizz said, spitting a wad of tobacco juice into a nearby cuspidor. He wants Cora's land. He's been trying to run her off since Henry died. This is the excuse he's been praying for. He'll create a massacre and call it a heroic defense. Which is why you need to go, the sheriff said quietly. You know the land better than anyone. You can slip out the back way, follow the dry wash. You can get to Black Creek without being seen. Warn her. Find out what in God's name is actually happening. Buy me some time to try and talk some sense into these fools. Grizz nodded, his expression grim. I'll go. But Emmett, if Thorne and his boys get there first, there won't be anything left to warn. Without another word, Grizz slipped out the back of the sheriff's office. Within minutes he was on his fastest horse, a wiry Appaloosa, galloping out of town through a series of back alleys and gullies, his body low over the horse's neck. He was racing against time, against a lie that was rapidly growing into a deadly truth. Back at the homestead, the afternoon heat was at its peak. Cora shared some of her dwindling supply of coffee with Shadow Hawk, who drank it with a curious solemnity. Taka was sleeping peacefully, the herbal poultice seeming to ease his pain. A strange sense of calm had descended, a feeling that was shattered when one of the Comanche sentries let out a sharp, bird-like call from the ridge. Shadow Hawk was on his feet. In an instant, his eyes narrowed. "Someone comes," he said. "One rider. Fast." Cora's heart leaped into her throat. Thorne. She ran to the edge of the porch, squinting against the sun. She saw the lone rider approaching a speck of dust on the horizon, growing rapidly larger. But the way he rode the lean, weathered figure hunched over the horse, it wasn't Thorne. "It's Grizz," she breathed, a wave of relief washing over her. "Caleb Vance. He's a friend." Shadow Hawk watched the approaching rider with suspicion. "Your friend comes in a hurry. He rides like a man with bad news on his heels." Grizz didn't slow down until he was 100 yards out, finally pulling his lathered horse to a stop, as a dozen Comanche warriors moved to intercept him, their lances leveled. He raised his hands high, showing they were empty. "Cora, Cora, Dean!" He yelled, his voice hoarse. Cora ran out to meet him, Shadow Hawk striding beside her. The warriors parted to let them through. "Grizz, what is it? What's happened?" she asked, her relief turning back to dread at the sight of his panicked face. "It's Thorne," Grizz gasped, breathing heavily. "He's raised a posse, 40, maybe 50 men. He's told them you're a hostage, that this is a war party ready to attack Redemption. They're drunk, they're scared, and they're coming. Reed's trying to hold them back, but he can't for much longer. They'll be here by sunset." The blood drained from Cora's face. She looked from Grizz's desperate expression to Shadow Hawk's suddenly hard, cold face, and then at the 150 warriors who had come to her home as protectors. The honor-bound guard and the bloodthirsty mob were on a collision course, and her small, lonely homestead was about to become a battlefield. The sun began its slow, bloody descent, mirroring the violence to come. Grizz Vance's warning shattered the tense quiet, and the homestead was instantly transformed. The Comanche warriors moved with a breathtaking, deadly efficiency. There was no panic, only purposeful action. Under Shadow Hawk's sharp commands, They turned the small farm into a fortress. Warriors melted into the shallow creek bed, using the bank as a natural trench. Others fanned out into the tall prairie grass, becoming invisible extensions of the landscape. A core group of archers vanished into the barn, ready to turn its loft into a nest of silent death. "They are fools," Shadowhawk said, his voice a low growl as he stood on the porch with Cora and Grizz. "They come to a place of honor with blood in their eyes. They will find it." "Please," Cora begged, her heart torn. "They're misguided, scared. Thorne has twisted them with lies. They're still farmers and shopkeepers, not soldiers." "Once a mob gets a taste for blood, there's no reasoning with it," Grizz countered, checking the action on his rifle. "Our only hope is to make this so costly for them. They break before it becomes a slaughter." Just as he spoke, there appeared a ragged line of horsemen, silhouetted against the dying sun on the eastern ridge. At their head was Bartholomew Thorne, and beside him, the reluctant figure of Sheriff Emmett Reed. They were not a disciplined army, but a chaotic cluster of men, fueled by whiskey and fear. You see, Thorne's voice boomed across the plains. "An ambush! We fight for our very homes." Sheriff Reed spurred his horse forward, a white handkerchief tied to his rifle. "Hold your fire!" he shouted. "I'm coming in to talk." Shadowhawk gave a curt nod, allowing the lone rider to approach. Reed's eyes widened as he took in the scene. Cora alive and well, the wounded boy in the doorway, the disciplined warriors in their defensive positions. This was no hostage situation. "Cora, are you all right?" he asked, his voice strained. "I'm fine, Emmett," she replied. "This is a terrible misunderstanding." Reed addressed the chief. "You have to pull your men back. Let me handle this." Shadowhawk's contempt was palpable. "Your law did not protect my son. This woman did. Now your law comes with guns. Tell your liar to take his mob and go, or we will send them to the spirit world." The ultimatum was absolute. Defeated Reed rode back to the posse. Knowing it was the last chance, Cora walked into the open yard, her hands raised. "Listen to me," she shouted. "You are being lied to. A boy was hurt. His people came in peace. The savage lover speaks," Thorne bellowed. "Don't listen to her." From the back of the posse, a nervous man flinched at a shadow and fired his rifle. The shot went wide, but it was the spark in the powder keg. The world erupted. The posse surged forward in a disorganized yelling wave, firing wildly. Instantly the Comanche answered. Precise shots from the creek bed dropped the lead riders. Silent arrows arched from the barn, finding their marks with terrifying accuracy. The settlers' charge dissolved into a brutal, one-sided skirmish. They were no match for the warriors' discipline. Seeing the attack faltering, Shadowhawk barked an order. A dozen warriors who had circled around in the tall grass rose up and charged the posse's flank. The surprise attack shattered the settlers' nerve completely. Attacked from two sides, they broke and fled their courage, vanishing into the twilight. Thorne saw his army, his grab for land and power, dissolving into a shameful rout. Rage and panic twisted his face. He looked past the chaos and saw the source of his failure, Cora Dean. It was all her fault. His plan in ruins, he gave in to pure hatred. Spurring his horse, he broke from the retreat and galloped madly toward the cabin, his revolver drawn and leveled directly at Cora. In the chaotic final moments of the battle, Bartholomew Thorne made a fatal error. Blinded by rage, he charged directly at Cora, his revolver aimed to kill. But he had forgotten the boy. From the cabin doorway, Taka hurled a small carved wooden toy. It struck Thorne's horse, making the agitated animal shy violently. The gunshot went wide, splintering the porch roof. That instant was all Shadowhawk needed. A blur of motion, he launched himself from the porch, tackling Thorne and ripping him from the saddle. Thorne hit the ground hard, his pistol flying from his grasp. Before he could recover, the Comanche chief was on him, a gleaming knife at his throat. The fighting sputtered to a halt as the entire posse watched their leader defeated. "Chief Don't Sheriff Reed yelled, riding forward with his hands raised. "Let the law handle him." Shadowhawk's eyes blazed. "This man brought war to my son's sickbed. He tried to murder the woman who saved him. My law is just." But it was Cora's voice that cut through the tension. "If you kill him, you prove every lie he told," she said, her voice steady. "They will call this a massacre, and a real army will come. For your son's sake, let him face justice in our world." Shadowhawk stared at her, his chest heaving. He looked at the pathetic, blubbering Thorne, at the shamed faces of the posse, and finally at his own son watching from the doorway. With a guttural roar of disgust, he hauled Thorne to his feet and shoved him toward the sheriff. "Take him! Leave this place!" The posse retreated in disgrace, carrying their dead and wounded their foolish war over. As a weary quiet settled, the Comanche prepared to depart. Shadowhawk approached Cora one last time, untying a hawk's talon from his neck. "You have the heart of a warrior and the spirit of a mother," he said, pressing the talon into her hand. "This land is yours. My people will know it. You are Korah, heart of the people. This will be a sign." With a final, solemn nod from Taka, the warriors melted back into the plains as silently as they had arrived. Cora stood alone on her scarred porch, the token of protection clutched in her hand. Her home was damaged, and her place in the settler world was now uncertain. But she was not broken. She had faced down a storm of hatred and survived, earning not just her life, but a new name whispered on the wind. The story of Cora Dean and the Omega Comanche isn't one you'll find in the history books. It's a tale etched into the land itself, a testament to a moment when courage mattered more than prejudice, and a life debt was paid with honor instead of blood. It reminds us that the Wild West wasn't just a simple story of cowboys versus Indians. It was a complex tapestry of individual choices, of unexpected alliances, and of profound humanity found in the most dangerous of circumstances. What would you have done in Cora's place? Would you have risked everything for a stranger, for a child, from a people you were taught to fear? These are the forgotten stories of the frontier we aim to bring to light. If this tale of bravery, betrayal, and unlikely friendship moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story with real heart. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the untold history of the American West.